Hey everybody, this is John for MTG Nexus coming at you with another deck overview. A long time in coming, and this is Mono Blue Tron, or actually the Thinking Mayan Tron deck. So this, much like its Urza Tron and Green Tron cousin, is trying to assemble the Tron lands. 1 + 1 + 1 = 7. One Urza's Mine, one Urza's Power Plant, one Urza's Tower, 7 mana in play, lets you do some broken things. Unlike its green counterpart, this deck is not trying to assemble Tron as quickly or as consistently as possible. Instead, you're trying to play some blue cards for some tempo gain. You're using things like Expedition Map to find your missing land piece, but you also have a bunch of utility lands that we'll talk about here in a minute. Beyond that, you're playing some value-based counter spells and bounce spells, things like Remand to slow your opponent down, along with Condescend, getting either draw cards or scry 2 off of your counter spells. And then you're using things like Repeal to put things back in your opponent's hand while you're setting up your game plan of trying to take over the game with big, beefy threats. The number one difference between this and Mono Green is this deck is very much set up around the card Mindslaver. Now, Mindslaver, along with 13 mana, means your opponent is never taking a game action again. So if you get Mindslaver, 13 mana, and Academy Runes, which is consistent, much more consistent than you'd expect in a deck like this, your opponent is never taking a turn. You're sacrificing Mindslaver, you're taking their turn, putting Mindslaver back on top of your deck, casting it again, activating again. Your opponent's never taking another game action, so the game is effectively over. The rest of the deck is a bunch of different threats for different situations. Worm Coil Engine for various aggressive decks or even mid-range decks like Jund or Rakdos Scam. Ugin the Spirit Dragon helps to deal with just a bunch of randomness, different situations, wiping the board against a bunch of decks. Sundering Titan when your opponent has a greedy mana base, maybe against 4-color Control or something like, or 4-color Omnath, Creativity, etc., coming down, blowing up a bunch of their lands. Oblivion Stone as a sweeper to blow up everything on the board, and then things like Talisman of Dominance to both fix your mana and to get you a little bit ahead on mana. The rest of the deck, now this particular list is by Shock Troopa, who is known very much for playing this deck, and he does like his one-ofs. So you have one-of Treasure Mage to find something by an artifact that value 6 or greater. Mindslaver, Worm Coil Engine, Sundering Titan. He also has Trinket Mage to find a card mana value 1 or less. So copies of Expedition Map, copies of Chalice of the Void, copies of Walking Ballista. A couple copies of Dismember to help slow down your opponent or kill annoying things like Magus of the Moon. Nimble of Obstructionist as a way to kind of stifle your opponent's triggers, also as a beatdown threat. And then finally, Engineered Explosives is kind of a catch-all against 1 and 0 mana plays. Helps clean up Rhino tokens, Urza Saga tokens, etc. Chalice of the Void, very good for coming down on 1 or 2 against decks like Burn, Hammer Time, etc. Also very good on 0 against decks like various Cascade, Living End, Rhinos, etc. Walking Ballista, very good against other small creature decks, especially if you can play this with Tron lands. You can just kind of come down, dominate the board, and take over from there. The land base, you are playing an eclectic mix of lands besides the Tron lands and some islands. You get to play things like Academy of Runes to put various artifacts back on top of your deck, as we've already kind of alluded to with the Mindslaver lock. But you can also gain some value with things like Expedition Map or Oblivion Stone. Blast Zone as yet another pseudo-sweeper in your list, pair with your Oblivion Stones and Engineered Explosives. Gemstone Cavern on the draw, this gets you a little bit ahead on mana at the cost of one of your cards. And then Hall of the Storm Giants allows you to have a big threat to close out the game when you have a bunch of mana in play. Tularia West allows you to search up any of your various either lands or chalices and walking ballistas. And that's pretty much the utility in the main deck. Sideboard, you get to play copies of things like Ratchet Bomb to deal with a bunch of your opponent's annoying things. Very good against things like Death Shadow, tokens, etc. Same thing with Engineered Explosives. Very good against low-to-the-ground aggressive decks like Hammer Time and Burn. Crucible of Worlds, whenever you're either fearing a bunch of land destruction from your opponent, or you just need to recycle a bunch of different stuff. But mainly, this is here when your opponent is playing things like Field of Ruin, etc., or might be playing some things like Pillage. Relic of Progenitus for any type of graveyard nonsense, decent against Murktide, really good against things like Living In and such. Tech Edge when you need to deal with your opponent's either Tron lands or things like Valakut or Urza Saga. Also very good against potentially something like Amulet. Spatial Contortion, we need a little bit more interaction against your opponent's early creatures. Spell Pierce, we need a little bit of early interaction against spells. Commandeer, when you just want to steal your opponent's big dumb spell. Mystical Dispute, very good against blue mirrors. And then Spreading Seas, very good in the Tron, Mirror, Urza Saga decks, etc. This is a very different type of mono blue deck. This one is based more around the card Karn the Great Creator, and you're seeing it more at the cost of playing some of the more bigger, higher end spells. But, you know, a lot of the other things are still the same. You're seeing things like copies of Remand, copies of Condescend and Repeal as early interaction, Engineered Explosives to help slow down the opponent, Walking Ballista once again helps to round out the threat base. Shark Typhoon is either a hard cast threat or just make a big shark, pressure your opponent while also continuing to cycle through your deck. Relic of Progenitus, whoever built this deck clearly didn't want to lose to things like Living End and Murktide especially, you know, while also being good against decks like Dredge that pop up on occasion. The rest of the deck, this being a Karn-based deck, makes it a little bit different. And then Thirst for Knowledge is a nice way to get card advantage while also putting relevant things in the graveyard. Sometimes you might want to bin a Wormcoil Engine or something against a deck like a Living End. Sideboard, this one's a little bit less of a sideboard because you are playing a Karn Wish board, but you do have a couple copies of Force of Negation to help against decks where you need more instant speed interaction, against decks like Rhinos, against decks like opposing Tron decks, etc. The rest of the sideboard, all Karn Wish board targets, Tormod's Crypt, and yeah, really, I guess that's it against graveyard-based stuff, but when you already have 3 relics in the main deck. Elixir of Immortality serves a couple different purposes. Good against mill, good against decks like Burn. Pithing Needle helps to shut down annoying permanents of your opponents, potentially things like Boseiju or Nawaru, Planeswalkers, etc. Liquid Metal Coating, kind of your go-to with Karn the Great Creator, let you start blowing up lands. Stone Brain, good against decks where they are reliant on one card, such as Amulet Titan, obviously naming something like Titan. Staring Bridge keeps your opponent from attacking. Oblivion Stone when you need another sweeper. Trinisphere comes down, makes it more difficult for your opponent to cast their cheap spells. Decks like Burn, etc. can be very problematic for them. Decks like Cascade, etc. Wormcoil Engine, good against the aggressive decks. Sundering Titan we've already kind of covered. Greedy mana bases go boom. Walking Ballista, very good against other creature-based decks and can kind of take over the board. The third, or another copy of Chalice here, besides the ones that are in the main deck. I guess there are no ones in this main deck, but good against the various Cascade decks or decks trying to cast 1-mana spells. And then Engineered Explosives, once again, when you need early sweepers against 0 and 1-mana threats. So that is Mono Blue Tron, what the deck is trying to accomplish. It is very good against the slow, mid-range, and control decks of the format. So, you know, it goes over the top of decks like Elementals, decks like Blue-White Control, Jund, etc. Where it tends to struggle against decks that, you know, try to do broken things very early in the game. So, struggles against decks like Burn, Hammer Time, you know, anything that's trying to do something very quickly, this deck tends to struggle with. Now, that's not said it can't win those matchups, but this deck is very much built towards a mid to late game meta, and this is very much a much more difficult to pilot deck than Green Tron. Green Tron, very much about hitting Tron on turn 3, casting your big threats, and trying to win the game. This deck more tries to disrupt what the opponent's doing, and then eventually take over with some type of powerful mid-game threat. Now, some of this deck is built upon the Mindslaver lock, some of the versions are built upon Karn, etc. So, lots of flexibility in what the deck is trying to do. Not a whole lot of utility or uniformity in the deck lists because, well, it's not really a meta deck per se, but something you might see on occasion. And if you run into someone like Shock Troopa, who has been playing this deck forever and ever, they can certainly be very skilled with it and win a lot of games. And it also happens to be the personal nemesis deck against Aspiring Spike, as every time he seems to play against this on camera, he loses, so there is that as well. So if you want a chance to win against Aspiring Spike or have a unique take on a control deck, this is certainly could be the deck for you. Don't forget, later in the week, we will have our top 5 modern lists for modern decks for March 2023. And we will also do a little bit of gameplay with Mono Blue Tron later in the week. Now, this is definitely a deck I'm not going to be extremely familiar with, but have seen enough of it played. Did watch some of Shock Troopa's streams back in the day, so I have some good idea of what the deck's trying to do. So we'll get some gameplay for it later in the week if you want to check it out. And don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. I hope to see you for the next video.